involved and interested in climate? I mean, you were sort of climate before climate was cool. Oh, bad choice of words.
Yeah, it's coming up on 30 years next
30
year.
years. So this...
Well, actually 32 if you count nuclear winter, which was a climate phenomenon that would go in the other direction.
So what triggered this? Where did this come from? How did you know it was a story?
I had no intention of being a climate reporter or anything like that. I grew up wanting to be a marine biologist in Rhode Island. I liked skin diving, and I worshipped Jacques Cousteau. And I kind of backed into journalism when I was 26. And then I had gotten a biology degree as an undergraduate, so I kind of gravitated towards stories in science. And there was this story. The atmosphere is interesting. The system is complicated. We were just talking about covering complexity. And that's what made it, you know, the first time I went to the Supercomputer Center, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and you see these teraflop, I think there were already teraflop per second machines back then, grinding out, you know, what would happen in a nuclear war to the atmosphere, and then later going back to write on climate. And you would think, well, gosh, why would you keep with that?
When did you realize it was a story and real? Man-made climate change.
Well, 1988, when I wrote my first long cover story, you know, I interviewed enough people.
This was for
Discover magazine back then. And although I scanned it and posted it, and it's online. The only reason it's online is because I digitized it. So
this is good. And the story was
that Jim Hansen had gone to the Senate. Tim Wirth was running a hearing, and he said, you know, in his view, it was already evident then that the 99% odds that we were already influencing the system in a perceptible way. So 1988, that was the last time CO2, the carbon dioxide, was at 350 parts per million, which is now this kind of iconic number that Hansen later defined as a safe threshold for warming. Yellowstone was on fire, an epic heat wave in the Midwest. It had all the elements of news. The science had been evolving for, as most people know, for 150 years, but this was the first time. It had actually been covered. I just did a piece on .Earth before I left .Earth a few months ago about, like, there were articles from the late 1800s about carbon dioxide and coal. But then it became a story, and then it kind of it came and went. You know, the Persian Gulf War happened, the first one, and oil prices were low. And so through the 90s, right after I wrote my first book on global warming, things were cooling a little bit because Mount Pinatubo had gone up in the Philippines, and so the whole issue went away for about 8 years, and then came back, storming back with the treaty fight, which I covered I was in The Hague, December 2000, while our presidency was being fought over in the Supreme Court. I was there covering the United States delegation fighting with Europe over the terms of the Kyoto Protocol. It was a really bizarre moment that felt a lot like some things have been going on recently. And then on and on and on and on.
Where are some of the places in the world you've gone to cover this story? Just rattle some places off.
Well, the Amazon, 1989, with that guy.
With Lovejoy?
Oh, yeah. I went to this camp that who someone's going to go to, and the food's really good.
Well, that's the only reason we're going.
No, but it's fascinating. You know, the idea that, it was a brilliant experimental idea. You know, the forest was going to get diced up, so why not do that in a scientific way and look at these fragments of different sizes. Fantastic work. I wrote a book about the Amazon, and it came out in 1990. I went to the North Pole in 2003, spring of that year, with scientists flying out and landing on the sea ice at the North Pole. And remember, the ice is only about from here to the ice is about 6 feet thick, that we landing a big airplane on a flat piece of that. And the ice is all moving. It's like a big turntable. You know, the Arctic Ocean is not like going to Antarctica. I have not been to Antarctica, but it's a lot harder to go to the North Pole because there's nothing there. There's no permanent anything. And that was amazing. And it was that trip that made me want to blog. We cobbled together a live reader forum from the sea ice at the North Pole. I had my satellite phone. And an editor on the desk, they posted some note on the Primeval website in 2003 saying, readers, post your questions for Andy Revkin. He's on the sea ice at the North Pole. And then she would
Did you get all the questions?
She would tell me the questions on the phone, and I would answer them, and she would type them in. So it took 40 minutes to send one photograph. Just by satellite.
These were prehistoric times.
Slow modem, you know, that.
Yeah.
But it was amazing.
What's the most dramatic thing that you have seen?
Greenland, too. And, I've been other places, too.
Go ahead. Just rattle them off.
The Vatican, the White House, the Greenland ice sheet.
There's a lot of hot air at the White House. It's responsible for a lot of climate change.
Well,
not just now. I mean, you know, through the years.
I just tweeted about something related to it. So check at Revkin and you'll see a little bit of news.
What did you know?
They should check it out.
But I'm not going to go to check it out.
This is how I foster connectedness on
he builds
Twitter.
community. He
At
knows
Revkin.
something about building community. Don't give it away. Make them work for it.
Exactly.
Okay. What's the most dramatic thing you've seen that says climate change to you?
Well, that's the issue with climate change. There is no single
We were just
thing.
talking about this actually.
It's the most prismatic story that is. And our session earlier on complexity, you know, a big chunk of the complexity is social. And that no one even, if I ask, and I do this with students sometimes, I say, okay, everyone here, write down on a piece of paper in 30 seconds, like one sentence, what's your definition of global warming? Like literally, boom. And even in a room like this, which is probably people who are mostly fairly like each other, you end up with diversity on that. And then I say, right on the other side of the piece of paper, how does it make you feel? And that, you end up with a diversity of opinions too. So it's not just complex science, it's complex perception. And you know, most of what we think of that looks like global warming actually is not, for the most part, especially right now, because we've built so much vulnerability on this planet so fast that we're in harm's way in places like Western wildfire zones. I'm sure someone here lives in California. You know, Monterey, that whole Monterey area that burned, man, there shouldn't be a house, there shouldn't be a fire-prone house anywhere in that region because it's just due to burn. So if I'm saying, well, that's climate change, well, you can say, well, it's like what we expect with climate change. So it's like, it's complicated. And that's one of the hardest things about it. It never fit on the front page very well.
No?
No, because you'd have to either simplify it and get it wrong, or if you try to make it true to its scope and nature, no one would read it because it would be buried in the paper and be too short and all that stuff.
So the hardest part of reporting climate change is its complexity. The hardest part of reporting climate change is its distance from now. The hardest part of reporting climate change is that you can't say this drought is due to this climate.
The hardest part of the climate problem is this, our inconvenient mind, which doesn't deal with
inconvenient mind.
I wrote some pieces with that phrase. I came so late. I hope there's at least one student here who's like either in sociology or psychology. Anyone? Those sciences. You know, I spent 20 years. The first 20 years of my writing on global warming were all about. Well, I had this very reductionist, simplistic approach that, like a lot of scientists do. Well, you know, it's a greenhouse gas, and it's like this, and you come up with more and more metaphors. Well, it's a long-lived gas. That means it's building like unpaid credit card debt, or you know.
Oh, that's so poetic.
You know, and if you don't, slowing your spending doesn't take away your debt. You know, you come up with all these clever ways, and then maybe win an award or two. But then it was around 2006 I started really digging in on why was it getting so polarized? And I talked to psychologists, and I felt so negligent afterwards because that science is so profound, and it says that most of the time information does not matter. And as a journalist,
it's the most depressing thing to hear as a journalist.
Oh yeah, no, it was one reason I went to Pace University was I literally started to assess. Well, I'm in my mid-50s, and what do I do the rest of my able-minded time? And so I went to academia to be effective, you know.
Yeah.
No one's laughing.
No comment.
Right. And now I'm back in full-time journalism, so that's interesting too.
Well, tell us about that. Why did you go back into full-time journalism after you went to seed your mind in academia?
Well, I was at the New York Times on staff for 14 years. I left the day after the Copenhagen talks wrapped up, and took a buyout and went to Pace University, and my blog, .earth, which I had started when I was a news reporter, became an opinion thing, just because they had a budget. And as I said earlier, my opinion is that reality matters. So I felt comfortable in that role, but it meant that I wasn't a very popular opinion writer, because we mostly navigate to someone to validate some worldview. And I was just, I'm kind of addicted to reality. And there aren't a lot of people, especially in today's media environment, who really want reality.
What did the social scientists tell you, and where are you now in terms of mind and science, and how, because we've talked about this as storytellers, how do you tell that story to get through to that reader or viewer? How do you communicate this complexity, this sort of what people think is a distant threat,
right,
but can't agree on whether it's really a threat or not?
Well, this is where if you're rigorously looking at the data, if you really interrogate the problem for what it is, the timescales are all completely screwed up in terms of expecting us to have some common response. It just, unfortunately, it's not going to happen that way. Because remember, even if we had if someone took control of the helm of the planet and said, who's very climate-wise, and said we have to stop emitting CO2 within 10 years, we're going to do that even better than Paris. We're just going to go zoom and hooray. The system won't notice that. The climate system won't notice that for several decades in a way that you could say, aha, we did it, yay. And so there's no ribbon to cut, there's no credit to take. And the thing that, one thing that I feel is important and valuable in my experience is I was covering the broader sustainability question, not just climate change, because there's so many other things happening right now. Peak us is happening between now and 2050, 2060. What happens after that is up to some very subtle tweaks in fertility rates. So the vulnerability of humans is going to max out before you would even have a perfect climate policy play out with some change in our vulnerability to this system. So that means that timescale, even if the election went a different way or whatever, it's not like you have a magical world with a safer climate when you have more than 9 billion people, 2 billion of whom, actually 3 billion likely, are still going to be cooking on firewood by 2030, 2040. That means work on vulnerability now and work on this big, long decarbonization challenge as well, but it's not changing the first one. So it's kind of like, I think having that broad view is helpful.
Talk about how you view as a journalist, as a storyteller, and as a climate expert, the advent of this current administration with respect to climate agreement from Paris, the trajectory that we're on, the acceptance, embrace of science and research.
I think the third thing is the most troubling thing. If the cuts to basic science and research and observational systems that allow us to track this dynamic and dangerous system, then we're in trouble. We'll see what emerges when the skinny budget becomes the real budget. I don't think it'll be nearly as skinny. I did a dangerous thing. I interviewed Will Happer, who is one of the two people who we know have been interviewed by Bush, by Trump, as a possible science advisor. And a lot of people were kind of yelling at me digitally. How could you? Because he's completely he's on another planet when it comes to what he thinks about CO2, carbon dioxide. I mean, he thinks it's great and more the better, and we can go back to the Carboniferous, and that's cool. But he's a brilliant physicist, and when I started talking to him about basic science and about observation and about Argo buoys, and he went on for like 5 minutes. We need all that stuff, and Congress sucks because they always want to cut those budgets. So I got him on the record on that, and I think that's it. Requires, as we were saying earlier, in the session with Monsanto, engagement with whoever you think or feel might be the enemy. Finding ways to engage on an interlaced planet is important. And the guy, he could end up. I don't think he will be the science advisor, but he could be. And should I not interview him? And so now he's on the record saying these important things. I think about basic issues. He also talked a ton about science education. And again, in ways that I thought were really smart. So if I had just walled him off, I will not talk to this guy because he's such a fill in the blank on CO2, then I would have lost some opportunities.
Is he a climate denier?
Well, let's talk about the word denier. I don't use that word.
Why?
Because I know many people who are in denial about what I just said earlier about that there's no quick fix. I mean, there's people I know who are in denial about the inevitability of a mixed energy system. I have good friends who are 100% renewable by 2050, absolutely, and they won't talk to you if you mention natural gas or nuclear. And
so they're fossil fuel deniers.
What kind of?
So what you're saying is you don't use the term denier because?
I used it in a few posts way back in the 2000.
But now you don't because?
Because we're all in states of denial on that issue.
But doesn't it matter if someone is a climate denier in the context of a climate change conversation?
No, it matters if they're a dissembler. In other words, what are you actually doing? Are you being actively dishonest? Is that denial, or is that something else? Or are you uneducated, or are you culturally unable to confront.
So how do you convey to your reader that someone does not believe that either climate change is happening or that human beings are inducing climate change?
I try. What I try to do is is it Actors Studio where they say, "What's my motivation?" And there's some Marlon Brando or somebody. What's my motivation? Yeah, Lee Strasberg, right? So I try to convey what I know about someone's motivation. If they're a lobbyist or if they're in industry, because there are plenty of people in the climate debate who are not climate scientists, who have very good views of climate science's implications for society, for example. Or there are plenty of climate scientists who yammer on about nuclear power or renewable energy as if they have some special authority there, and they don't.
A couple more, and then we'll go to the audience.
Sure.
What do you make of the current administration and its implications, timelines aside, for the commitment, progress on climate?
Well, I wrote when I wrote my first long pieces at ProPublica are
really
books. But I wrote a piece, a reasonable piece, assessing things very early December. And in talking to a lot of people and thinking a lot, it looked like the thing that could do the most harm is the thing that's the most probable. And it's not killing the Clean Power Plan. It's cutting off funding for the commitments the U.S. made to the Paris process, the $3 billion or so dollars, because that's the leverage there is huge. There's a big chunk of developing countries for whom that money is far more meaningful than the discussions of 1.5 or 2 degrees. And the least developed countries, the vulnerable forum, the climate vulnerable forum. And that means at that point, and they've already been threatening, and I've seen this in earlier cycles of the treaty process, when they're going to walk out and it could start to unravel. And that's the thing that I think could do the most damage.
And where is that in the process now?
It's pretty much a done deal. I mean, I don't think he's actually gotten to the point where that's officially inscribed.
So that money goes away?
Yeah.
And then what happens?
Then that process becomes weaker. And it's already, when I wrote about it, the good news about Paris was after the whole process, I've been writing about this since before the first treaty, since before the IPCC. That whole process from Rio through Copenhagen, so 1992 to 2009, had this overinflated hope that you could have a treaty come out that looked like a contract, meaning binding targets and tables, something you all sign, the lawyers look at it. And that was never going to happen on a 196-country planet with all these variegated points of view, even on what the climate problem is. And there were people Thomas Schelling, a great economist who died recently at the age of 100, I think. He won a Nobel Prize. In 1991, 90, and there, some of the older folks will remember this, he was writing about soft law, that the only way to get 200 or whatever, all these countries in a room is without binding targets and timetables. But it took all this bumping into walls all the way through. The Kyoto process was a dead end, and Copenhagen was like a hard stop. And then everyone said, well, you know what, now instead of having a journey to a destination, this is what's so cool about Paris. Paris was where the destination is a journey. I mean, everyone agreed to a 100-year journey. Let's go on a decarbonization journey. Let's go on a resilience journey and an energy transition journey. But it integrated about a 100-year timescale, which is what it's going to take. I wrote a piece a year and a half ago, on my own learning curve, on climate for 30 years. And I hit my own walls as a journalist. I thought it was a pollution problem because it looked like one. I grew up in the 80s and the 70s with pollution, you fix it. And then I thought, well, okay, it's a diplomatic problem. And then I thought it's a technology problem. And each one of those notions or hypotheses got defeated by interesting things that I learned along the way. And then you start to realize, well, maybe, I think in the end, and this could be seen as hopeful or hopeless, depending on your personality, worldview. It's an issue. It's what we're doing is we're building a new relationship with the climate system. After having our species, if you count the hominins, the pre-human, it's been a million-year journey in which climate did stuff to us. It was a one-way system. And it's only been 50 years, not even 50 years, since we've really started to look up and go, oh, you know what? This is becoming a two-way street. And that's a fundamentally new idea. And it's going to take time.
The Anthropocene.
Well, I was on the Anthropocene working group because of something I wrote in my first climate book a long time ago. But yeah, we're grappling. What the Anthropocene is about, it's not about words or geology, it's about ownership. There have been other species on this planet. Cyanobacteria, 2 billion years ago, whatever it was, flooded this system with oxygen for the first time, and all the anoxic species went, oh, crap. Mass extinction, but the cyanobacteria weren't sitting there going, wow, look what we just did. You know? But we're just starting to do that. So, so that makes it, for me, in the end, it feels more like building a relationship is different than solving a problem.
Last one, and then we come to your questions. How are you writing your stories differently now, if at all, given the shift in political environment, given the sociology of our brains that you have learned, and given the news organization that you're now at, ProPublica, which is, for those of you who may not be aware, a remarkable, philanthropically driven, fundamentally investigative news system. I'm not going to call it a news organization. I'm going to call it a news system.
It's an amazing experiment, and it seems to be working. It's in its 10th year. They've won 3 Pulitzer Prizes, 2 Emmys, more to come, hopefully a couple this year. We'll see. I'm awed when I look around this little newsroom. It's 60 or so people, and there's 6, I think, out in the Bay Area. And it's like a special forces unit without the Army. That's what everyone in that, they all have super skills, you know? It's like the data person and the FOIA person and the engagement person, they all have super skills. And, but the mantra, every editor, that we are infused with 2 things. One is accountability. It's accountability journalism with moral force.
Wow.
So that every story has to satisfy those 2 things. And
accountability journalism with moral force.
Right, and accountability is data. You know, don't tell me, show me. Or if you can't show me, then I'll find it myself. Thanks, you know. And by the way, we're very easy to leak too. I have Signal on my phone. I never had that before, that app but I guess the CIA cracked it, but whatever. With moral force, and moral force means, you know, identify things where there's an underdog, and usually, now, and when I applied for this job, I kind of said, well, climate is not quite like this, you know. You could do a lot more award-winning stories about what Exxon knew, great stuff, important, but that's not the story. So my pitch for this job was like, I'm gonna investigate the climate problem wherever it takes me, meaning the big picture. But then Trump got elected, and so for the first 3 months, it's been very Trump-focused. But I am breaking away now to do this bigger look.
And how do you tell this story in the age of Trump?
Well, it's talking to a lot of people. In fact, just a little while ago, I was talking to a meeting with some people this afternoon inside the system and trying to kind of gauge.
Are they leaking to you?
Yeah.
You
well,
hope so.
Well, my first big scoop at ProPublica a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, was Jim Mattis, the Secretary of Defense. When he was doing his hearing, senators get to ask these follow-up questions, questions for the record. And someone told me that there were 4 or 5 questions that were asked of him about climate change. I thought, well, that's weird. I Googled around, and I saw they weren't public yet. So this is a hearing where he answers those privately afterwards, you know, writing. So I poked and poked and poked and poked. And the weird thing is there were Democrats on the committee who asked the questions, but they hadn't released the stuff. And it turned out it was really interesting. Among other things, he said, climate change is affecting risks where we have troops on the ground right now. This is Jim Mattis, Secretary of Defense. So that either means he's going to be completely walled off from the White House on that issue or not. But it means that there are some sparks of, you know, reality out there.
Well, yesterday we heard, and I just want to, I lied because I said I'd come to you, but I want to do a follow-up here because yesterday we heard from Kate Brandt, who is now the sustainability lead at Google. She was the Chief Sustainability Officer of the United States. Before that, she was working with Ray Mabus when he was Secretary of the Navy. And one of the things she was doing, and they were doing, was bringing a lot of climate change sensibility and sustainability to the Navy, including a lot of biofuels being used. Is the commitment of the Pentagon, which is the largest single user of energy, still in place for it to be, and it to need to be, a sustainable, innovative place?
Yeah, well, I wrote... The first time I wrote about the Pentagon's view of global warming was 2001, when I saw a report called Naval Operations in an Ice-Free Arctic. Okay. That was 2001. And it goes back further. Way back in the early days of the Bush administration, there were Pentagon papers on, not the Pentagon papers, for those who remember, but there were reports on climate change implications. And, you know, if you're looking, just the Arctic alone, if you can't realize that there are strategic implications to having...
But recognizing the strategic implications versus being in the forefront of some of this innovation and sustainability are different things.
Well, no, but that's, you see, that's strategic for them. And Mattis has been very strong on that about, you know, when you're moving fuel, you're endangering troops, and that's everything they've been doing about green fuels and stuff is to make sure they don't have disrupted supplies. And that's not so clearly linked to decarbonization initiatives.
Let's go to some questions from the floor for Andy Revkin. And are we doing mics? Can we come down to the front row here?
By the way, if someone could post the link to the Facebook Live on my Facebook page, that'd be great. I was trying to do it on my phone, and I didn't.
Okay, we got that. We'll get to that. Zoe's got it.
Good. Hi, I'm... Is this on?
Yep.
Is this on? Check. I'm Jacob. I'm from Oregon, and I'm part of a climate lawsuit, and very basically we're suing the U.S. government to try to have the courts order them to basically enact a plan that would reduce carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to 350 parts per million by 2100. And I think as young people, we, to a certain extent, are looking for hope, and we need hope. And so my question to you is, from what I've heard today, my question is like, what is one story that you've written that you would consider to be the most hopeful, or what would you have to say to young people in the audience who are looking for that hope in the face of all that you've just said, which is that, you know, we're really looking at a system and a situation where there doesn't seem to be any.
Oh, no, I don't feel that way at all.
Well, yeah.
When I describe the shape of the problem, think about this. We work on education, we work on security, we work on public health as perennial issues that you work on. I don't think anyone who's deeply involved in any of those issues thinks that he or she is going to solve that problem necessarily in a lifetime. There have been problems that have been solved in lifetimes. Social change can happen quickly with some of the remarkable progress there, although some of it might get rolled back. But there's kind of like, when you realize it's something you're not going to fix, I think it takes, I saw, oh no, it was the other panel, there was the word letting go or grieving or something. There is a process of letting go when you realize something is not like you thought it was. You know, the Clean Air Act really did clean our air. And China is really going to clean their air. But that's different than reduce their CO2 to zero. CO2 is so much linked to energy. So it's like, once you have to get, I think when there's a comfort factor can emerge there. Like, and this is like even on the Anthropocene, I had a big debate online with some people about whether you could have a good Anthropocene. In a week, there's another meeting here, just before Earth Day. There's the Earth Optimism Summit here in D.C.
Yeah.
And, you know, there were people who were optimistic during World War II. You know, you get out there and you live the best life you can. Even in your course of your own life, I mean, when you're young, it's harder to do this, but when you get to be over 60, like some of us, you start to, you know, you realize life is finite, so you focus more on quality and empathy and sharing and making other people's lives better, and not so much on, like, can I live forever? Because, you know, no one's going to live forever. Maybe. Well, we'll see if we become cyber creatures. So it's like this thing. And when I tell people about Bill McKibben, my old friend Bill, you know, we differ on a lot of things. And I say, don't just listen to his rhetoric, which is urgent, urgent, act, act, act. Look at his life. It's discipline, get up every morning, do something, and do it again. And his book, I wrote about this. I did a piece called The Long Climate and Energy March around the time of the march in New York, where I was saying, I was talking about time scales and what do you do. And that's what you do. You have to develop discipline to keep at it, and agility, so that, like, there's a young guy, Billy Parrish, who I met when he was about your age in Montreal Climate Talks in 2005, and he was in Energy Action. He organized the group Energy Action. And now he's running a thing called Solar Mosaic, which is a financing system for solar panels. But he found a way he's still at it, you know, like sort of like a salmon going up a river. So, but I don't think he expects, he's got huge challenges just making that business model work. So, you know, you just keep on keeping on. And I think that can come with a sense of liberation and success even though the problem, you know, the world in 100 years from now, in so many different ways, is going to be so profoundly different than now. That takes some letting go as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Question over here? Harrison's got a question.
Hi, my name is Harrison Watson from Jackson State University. I kind of just want to continue off of what you were discussing with Jacob, and this idea of bringing forth that life is not going to continue on, especially considering the fact that we are being actualized or realized to the idea of mass extinction with global warming being such a big idea nowadays. What would you say to the collective I guess, human species, to our shift in purpose being not to sustain ourselves now, but as you said, 100 years from now, the earth is not going to be the same. What would you say to our purpose instead being helping out whatever's going to come next? Shifting not our purpose into sustaining ourselves, but ushering in the new life of whatever decides to come thereafter.
There actually is a voluntary extinction movement. It's tiny. I think there's a website, Voluntary Extinction, where we decide to not keep at it. I don't recommend that.
Oh, no, not like that.
But you know,
that's not what you're saying, is it?
No, I know you're not. But although in a way you are, you're saying let go of our leadership role, essentially. I guess. The engagement is the thing. This is what I love about the word Anthropocene, which is such a silly word. I wrote a whole long article about it because of my long history with that. But I said the best thing about the word is not the word or whether it's a geological layer. It's the conversation that has emerged around it. The competing terms like the Capitalocene, the Manthropocene, that's one of my favorite. This environmental economist in England, she said, I'm not nearly as afraid of the Anthropocene as I am of the Manthropocene. This is when I wrote in 2014, I looked around at the Anthropocene working group of which I was a part and realized it was all male, the meeting. So finding that, what you're discussing right now is the shape of our journey. What do you want to be as a species? And that is the human question right now. Because again, if you look at this on a longer time scale, it's not like, 1,000 years ago, people were already having conversations that were like this, through religion and other ways. But now we have this awareness of the system that we're in and that we're implicitly part of it. And that we are in the driver's seat in many ways for biology, for climate. And that's just created this whole vital question with certainly no one answer. But find your place in that conversation. And what you're talking about is a values-shaped reaction more than a data-shaped answer. And so understanding that is a really good starting point, too, that values are really what's going to shape the journey. And by the way, when I was at the Vatican in 2014, we had a week-long meeting, and it was scientists and economists and philosophers and an Argentinian labor rights lawyer. And it was the meeting was called Sustainable Humanity, Sustainable Planet, Our Responsibility. It should have had a question mark on the end. And it was the best meeting I've ever been at in the sense of the richest stew around that kind of question. If you have time, and it ended for me, and I capped my stories about it with this amazing oceanographer, physical oceanographer, a numbers guy, Walter Monk, who was 96 at that time. And we were sitting after a week of sessions and all this existential stuff. And I said, so Walter, how's this going to play out? And he's a lauded, amazing mind, a technocrat and a scientist, and he paused and he said, it'll take a miracle of love and unselfishness. This is a quant, and he came up with that answer, and that was, to me, a very stimulating moment.
Thank you.
Thank you. Alex? Oh, you got one? All right, it'll come back to you.
Sorry. So I was just wondering...
Can you just identify yourself?
Tom Falkowski from SUNY ESF. We've heard a similar story before with CFCs, and we had a very successful solution with the Montreal Protocol. And now we've gone through several iterations with Copenhagen, with Paris, right, with Montreal as well. So I'm wondering, and they seem like very similar stories, but the outcomes have been drastically different. Yeah. So I'm wondering, in your experience, what separates these two stories with climate change and our reaction to CFCs?
Money and the economy, and not just the economy, but basically CFCs are this big part of our economy and of our lives. They were refrigerants and propellants, and And there were substitutes, and they were affordable. When I wrote my book in global warming in 1992, there was a line in there from Peter Winsemius. I bet Tom Lovejoy remembers him. He said, you could get the CEOs of all the companies that made CFCs into one small room. But you can't do that with CO2. It's every taxi driver and power plant and air conditioning manager, and it's so fundamentally linked to our, remember, 85% or so of our energy is still from fossil fuels, and the energy transitions are implicitly tough. They're slow. And so it's not like you can just do I've written about it too, beyond that books. It's just a very different scale. And I think, but that was like part of my learning curve too. In fact, when I wrote this, if you just go to j.mp/Revkin, 30 years climate, that's too long.
Oh, right.
Yeah, right. Well, when it's archived, people can look it up. Or Revkin.
What should they Google?
30 years, Revkin climate. It was in a magazine called Issues in Science and Technology. It was IS&T. And I go into that in there.
We need to move on. I want to ask you one last question here directed to the students. I told you it was going to come. Are you sure? You can get them later. We've been talking over the last couple of days about how they should be the storytellers of the future. How they should still tell stories from their campuses and their communities, from their travels, from their lives. How you capture character and ideas, science and data, but in ways that will land, that will be compelling, that will have impact, that will drive knowledge and attitudes, maybe even behavior. What advice do you have?
Sure. Well, any storytelling starts with what do you want to get done? If it's just to engage someone in an entertaining story, then that's a simple thing in a way. It's drama and conflict and that. If you want to influence someone's trajectory, that's a very different story shape. And it would start with some listening, for sure. So it sounds odd to talk about telling a story by listening, but I think it's knowing your audience, or whichever audience you want to reach. And if it's a complicated story that might involve ways to speak that are beyond your capacity, then a networked way to tell that story is what you want. Like when I taught a course at Pace University in online communication, I didn't expect everyone in the room to be able to do an animated GIF or even edit video, but you know somebody who can do that. So make sure you have if you don't have the talent and can't learn it, then make sure you have a network that can help you tell the story. But the bottom line is, a story, and Randy Olson, he's a friend of mine, he cribbed this from Trey Parker, one of the South Park guys. And Trey, in some documentary about South Park, Trey Parker said, anytime you're replacing the word and with the word but or the word therefore, that's when you're telling a story. I went to the market and I bought some eggs and I went home and made an omelet. That's not a story. I went to the market and I got some eggs, and as I was going to the cashier, I realized I didn't have my wallet, and this whatever, then you hook somebody because there's this sense of but. This is denial of, and he also talks about the hero's journey. Stories all involve, and your life will involve challenges, finding people to help you solve them, and resolution. So that's
compelling characters overcoming obstacles to achieve an outcome, right?
Or trying. Heroically.
Trying. And maybe sometimes the setback is the outcome. You're going to be around. People will be able to chat with you here and at lunch. Would you join me in thanking Andy Revkin for being with us today?
Thank you. Thank you for having me.